Tantor Audio presents Midnight in Malmö by Torquil MacLeod. Narrated by Marguerite Gavin. Prologue. Were all Russians so greedy? I'd never seen anything like it. Certainly not in my time at the Savoy Hotel. It was as though they hadn't eaten for weeks. I had to admit that many of them didn't look well fed. They were certainly making short work of the beautifully prepared smorgasbord we'd laid out on the long table a short while before their arrival. They called it zakushki. They were a motley collection of individuals, men, women, and a couple of young boys. Maybe it was the fault of the war. I'd read awful things in the newspapers. Germans fighting the English and French, Russians fighting Austrians and Germans. Terrible death and destruction. So the local newspapers had reported over the last 3 years. Not that we'd been immune to the effects of the war. Our trade had been seriously harmed, and national rationing was introduced later that year after a poor harvest. Yet the patrons of our hotel wouldn't have known that supplies were short when they sat down to dine. Money always has a way of overcoming such difficulties. By then, our guests were mainly Swedes, as foreign visitors had rarely appeared since the outbreak of the war. Despite the ravenous wolves devouring all that was put in front of them, one of their number remained aloof. He didn't touch a morsel. He was deep in conversation with Herr Furstenberg, the Polish gentleman who'd organized the meal. The kitchen staff had been on high alert for 3 days, but during that time there had been no sign of them. All we knew was that a special party of Russians was coming by ferryboat into Trelleborg. Augustin, our head waiter, had told us they were coming from Sassnitz. I couldn't believe this at the time, as we all knew that Russia and Germany were at each other's throats. But this man who talked so earnestly with Herr Furstenberg was different from the others. Where Herr Furstenberg was elegantly dressed with a flower in his buttonhole, this fellow was unprepossessing at first glance, yet I found it difficult to keep my eyes off him as I served the other guests. Short, wiry, and stooped. His clothes were baggy and crumpled. A thin strip of red hair encircled his bald crown. His beard was short and pointed, and he had penetratingly dark eyes. His features were almost Asiatic. I heard someone refer to him as Herr Ulyanov. I'd no inkling who he was, or what he was doing in Malmö. We'd read that Russia was in turmoil and that the Tsar was no longer ruling. Such a thing seemed impossible, yet the world beyond our borders had gone mad. All I knew was that Herr Ulyanov and his party were not staying at the hotel, but were leaving by the midnight train to Stockholm from the central station opposite, on the other side of the canal. I was pleased that they were going, as I didn't relish the prospect of serving these boorish people again over breakfast. As I swiftly moved down the corridor outside, my hands full of dirty plates, I heard a loud thudding on the wooden floor behind me. I turned round. Herr Ulyanov was there. The source of the noise was his studded mountain boots, which seemed strange footwear for a train journey. He raised a hand to catch my attention and said something. I thought it was in French. He saw that I didn't understand, so he spoke in English, a language I'd learned to use when dealing with our American and British guests before the war. "I am trying to find a bathroom," he said. His eyes engaged mine as he spoke. I remembered how hypnotic they were as they narrowed in amusement. I was about to direct him when another figure appeared at the end of the corridor and, after a moment's hesitation, made his way towards us. The man was short with a heavy coat, and he wore a wide-brimmed hat which virtually covered his eyes. "Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov?" he asked. Herr Ulyanov nodded. The man in the hat reached inside his coat. I suddenly realized he was pulling out a pistol. Chapter 1. Rivulets of sweat were now trickling down her face from the bunched blonde hair under her baseball cap. She was really pushing herself, pumping those legs, those much-admired legs. It was important that she stay in good physical shape, hence her pacey jogging, Yet she wasn't exactly sure why she was driving herself so hard round Pildammsparken this late on a summer's evening. Was it to expunge the last few hours? Was it self-loathing? That was silly. She rounded the lake. The lights from the hospital buildings on the other side twinkled and danced in the half-dark. Though it still wasn't dusk, the heavy cloud cover was taking its toll on the available light. She strode on. There were few people about at this time. She virtually had the park to herself. She liked that. She liked being anonymous. That was the beauty of cities, yet she could never live in one now. Maybe it was her upbringing in a small rural town. She remembered how her father used to bring her to Malmö as a youngster. It had seemed magical then, especially around Christmas when the shops were lit up and the electric holiday candles gleamed from every office and apartment window. He had brought her here to the park, taken her to the cinema, and usually rounded off their day with a meal at a nice restaurant in somewhere like Lilla Torja. Later, Malmö had lost its charm, but that wasn't the fault of the city. And her poor father, the thought spurred her on. That and the horrid shock she had had earlier in the day. She had seen him. It had upset her badly. It had brought back all the old fear, dread, and revulsion. She sprinted down the bank, over the road that cut through Pildammsparken and across into the trees. She would finish the circuit of the plate before heading back to the apartment. Now she was alone in the tall trees, the moon flitting through the branches as it dodged one cloud before being swallowed up by another. It would soon disappear altogether, as the forecast had predicted heavy overnight rain. She would get back to the apartment before that started. With the end of her run in sight, her practical mind took over. She slowed her pace. She would make final arrangements after she had showered. There would have to be an early start in the morning for her next appointment, but at the weekend she would have that well-deserved break she had promised herself, a bit of me-time. As she ran on, she became aware of someone close behind her. Another jogger. How annoying. She was enjoying the park's emptiness. Someone was invading her privacy. She upped her tempo so she could pull away from this unwanted presence. Yet the other joggers seemed to be gaining on her. She slowed down so that he or she could pass, and then she could return to her own pace. She didn't turn round, but she could hear the controlled, rhythmic breathing of the runner, now almost next to her. It was an unpleasant feeling, her space being occupied. She had reduced her speed to a trot when she felt a sharp pain in her back, like a gigantic pinprick. Then she stumbled. Something had been stuck into her. The momentum propelled her forward, making it impossible to turn round to see her assailant. She tried to twist so that she could reach behind her with her hand, but she lost her balance and collapsed to her knees. Her jogging top felt sodden. She realized that it must be blood. Then the object was forcibly removed and, a second later, driven back in. And now the searing pain. Her attempted scream of terror came out as a grunt, as myriad images swirled around her brain then sank into an abyss. Her last coherent thought was, why was this happening? Chapter 2. Anita Sundstrom hoped she wasn't making a ghastly mistake. A decision made in haste to be repented at leisure. Well, over the next 2 weeks. She stood nervously on the single platform of the small station in Simrishamn, the end of the line from Malmö. The day had turned out bright and warm after the previous night's heavy rain, though she found herself shivering slightly as she looked down the deserted track while she waited for his train. She knew he was on it, as he had texted ahead. She glanced across to the red brick police station. Windows were open to let in much-needed air. Police life would be going on as usual. It reminded her that it was good to be on holiday. Her month-long summer leave had begun 3 days ago. When the weather was like this, it was good to get out of the city and escape to the countryside and coast of her beloved Esterlen. She instinctively felt for her snus tin in her bag. Of course it wasn't there. She had given up for nearly a month now. She knew it was a filthy habit, but it had kept her cravings for a cigarette at bay for a few years. Now, giving up the snus was the next step. She knew she had done it with him in mind. Snus was a thing that the British couldn't get their heads around. She had also spent more time than usual getting herself ready before she set off for the station. This afternoon, she had stood in front of the mirror longer than she'd done in the whole of the last month. She decided she didn't look too hideous for someone coming up to 46. Mind you, she had increased her jogging over the last couple of months to try and lose the bit of extra weight that had crept up on her, particularly round the tummy. But her exercise regime had done the trick, and she could now wear clothes that hadn't fitted her at Christmas. Today, she had forsaken her usual jeans or trousers and decided to give her legs an unaccustomed airing. The floral dress she wore was short, and she began to worry that her legs weren't as brown as she would have liked. If this weather continued, then a few days on the beach would remedy that. Another concern was whether he'd like her hair. After having it short for many years, she had grown it out over the last few months, and now it reached her shoulders. She wasn't sure it suited her, though Wallen had been complimentary at work. So had Lasse and Yasmin. At least they were less of a worry now that they had moved into an apartment together. However, the Mearses still didn't approve of their daughter living with her son, and Anita had been forced to play the role of peacemaker on a couple of occasions. And now Yasmin's brother Hakim was back to help. It was great to have him at the police house again. After a year and a half up in Gothenburg, he had returned last month when an opening had become available in the Criminal Investigation Squad. Now he was a fully fledged detective. Even the miserable Chief Inspector Mowberry seemed vaguely pleased that he was around. In fact, Mowberry's moods had been more equitable of late, since his third wife's patience had snapped and she had walked out on him. The only change in his lifestyle, as far as the team could see, was that, now his domestic cook had downed utensils and left, he ate out even more than before. It had been a strange year and a half while Hakim had been away. She had been given a long, compassionate leave after the Westermark incident, in which her detective colleague had blown his brains out in front of her. The therapy sessions had been more useful than last time, though the image of Carl Westermark's final moments still plagued her, and often she screamed in the night. She wasn't sure if she did it any more. Since Lasse had moved out, there was no one to tell her. The disturbing dreams persisted, though. The team hadn't been the same again on her return to work. Too many scars that would never heal. The loss of her mentor, Henrik Nordland, murdered by Westermark, had been particularly hard on her. As a group, they were still professional, but it often felt as though they were just going through the motions. Maybe Hakim's return would help. Anita eyed the police station across the road again. Maybe she had had enough of Malmö, and she should spend the last years of her career in a quieter backwater like Simrishamn. She still had school friends living in the area, and she didn't see much of Lasse these days, so the ties with the city were loosening. It was something to ponder during her month off. She was pleased that she had managed to secure the same holiday home overlooking the sea that she had taken in the early months of last year, when she was mentally sorting herself out after Westermark's bloody exit. She became aware of the people around her stirring and staring up the line. She followed their gaze and could see the sun glinting off the outline of the train. Once again, she hoped that this wasn't going to be a disaster. Chapter 3. The rain pitter-pattered on the roof of the crime scene tent as Hakim Mirza zipped up his white plastic suit and pushed his way through the canvas opening. It had been raining all night, which wasn't going to help Eva Thulin and her forensics team. Eva looked up from the body she was examining and gave the tall, young detective a wan smile. "Ah, Anita's prodigal son has returned. Welcome back. Where is she?" "On holiday," he replied as he cast an eye around the scene. Clara Wallen was already there, but there was no sign of Pontus Brode. "Where's Brode?" he asked Wallen. The short, slightly muscular detective, with dark hair severely scraped back into a ponytail, replied with a resigned shrug. "The chief inspector's on his way," Hakim added as a warning. The prospect didn't improve her mood. With Anita away, Chief Inspector Mowbray might ask her to front the investigation. She wasn't sure she was up to it. "What have we got?" asked Hakim. "Female jogger, probably in her mid-30s. Wallen answered. As she was out running, we don't have any identification. Only had a key on her, and a pendant in the shape of a cross. With that, she left the tent." Hakim could see the blonde hair behind Thulin's arched body. A baseball cap lay on the ground close to the victim's head. "How did she die?" "Stabbed twice in the back. The second incision killed her. It looks as though her assailant came up behind her." "Was she running away from her attacker?" "I can't be sure, but the cleanness of the first stab indicates that she may not have known that someone was about to harm her. The second one isn't as precise, as she was probably beginning to fall forward from the impact of the first blow, but the second thrust did the damage." "Which side did the attacker approach?" "Judging by the angle of the initial wound, her assailant was coming up behind on the woman's left shoulder." "So was probably right-handed?" "Yes." As Hakim tiptoed round Thulin, he could see that the woman lying lifeless on the ground had attractive long legs. Thulin caught his glance. Beautiful girl. Thulin lifted up the victim's right hand. Immaculate fingernails. She certainly looked after herself. "Was she sexually assaulted?" "Doesn't appear so. We'll need to get her back to the lab to make sure. But her running shorts don't appear to have been disturbed. Pity, as that would have given us some DNA. "Time of death?" "Last night between 10 and midnight. Again, I'll know more later." "Is this the spot where she was killed?" "Probably. There's no indication that she was moved." Hakim observed the interwoven mishmash of muddy footprints close to the body. "Who found her?" "Unfortunately, it was a group of elderly runners first thing this morning." She nodded at the footprints, trampled everywhere. "After the rain last night, you can see the mess they've made. You'll never find the perpetrator's footprints under that lot." "So if they were the first to see the body, it's fairly safe to assume that this happened when no one else was around." "Possibly. But when did the rain start last night?" "I'll check that out," said Hakim, making a note. "The rain may have kept people away until this morning." Just then, the vast figure of Chief Inspector Eric Mowbray waddled into the tent. He was bursting out of his plastic suit. Wallen trailed in his wake. Hakim let Wallen update him, with Thulin throwing in the odd comment as she continued to examine the body. When they had finished filling him in, Mowbray sighed. "I don't think the world will miss another fucking jogger. Bloody waste of time." Hakim realized that working for Mowbray was going to be exactly as it had been in his trainee days. The man was all heart. "Well, those geriatric runners may have buggered up the ground here, but I still want a thorough forensic search of the area." "Don't we always do that?" Thulin muttered from her squatting position. Mowbray chose to ignore her comment. "If she's a jogger, I assume she hasn't come too far." Thulin passed Mowbray 2 small, clear, plastic evidence bags. "A key. Only thing on her. Presumably it's for her apartment. The pendant was round her neck. Looks quite old to me." "So, we'll have to start going from apartment to apartment round the perimeter of the park." Did Mowbray realize how many apartment blocks were round Pildammsparken? Wallen thought wearily. "And that includes the medical staff over there." Mowbray airily waved a hand in the direction of Malmö's Skåne University Hospital. "Wallen, you and Broad can organize the apartment visits. Where is Broad?" "Haven't seen him this morning," Wallen admitted. Instead of being annoyed, Mowbray grinned. "The poor sod can't take his drink. We had a few last night on the way home. Better give him a call, though. Tell him to get his arse down here. And we'll also need to speak to regular joggers. Mirza, that's yours. They may know who she is, so we'll need an artist's impression done pronto. Can't show ghoulish photos to the public or we'll get into trouble." "Do you want me to get in touch with Anita?" Hakim couldn't believe that Wallen had made such a suggestion. She would be furious being dragged in from her holiday. She lives just opposite the park and jogs round here, I believe.
No, Moberry snapped. You think we're incapable of solving this without bloody Anita Sundstrom?
Wallen shook her head in submission.
We can't have the woman thinking we can't operate without her.
Chapter 4. He noticed her blonde hair and glasses as he peered out of the window of the train as it approached the platform. He gathered his luggage together. His heart missed a beat. He had been waiting for this moment for so long. He couldn't believe his luck when Anita had phoned him several months after they had worked together on the Air Hunters case. He had hoped that she would. But after time passed, he had despaired of any contact. He realized that their brief, fumbled love-making during her time in England had been because she had lost someone close to her. It was in a moment of vulnerability. He still didn't know who the person was, and had not pried further. Her call out of the blue was followed by the occasional email. She gave little away. And then he had mentioned in one that they should meet up. To his amazement, she had agreed, and they had got together for a weekend in London. It hadn't been an outstanding success, but it hadn't been the debacle it could have been either. They had got on fairly well, even if it was a case of him doing most of the talking. Having booked separate rooms at the hotel, they had ended up in the same bed on the last night. Both had performed a lot better than on the previous occasion, less tense, more relaxed. The problem was that when the weekend ended, he still had no idea where he stood with her. Were they a potential couple, or was it a fleeting friendship? The emails continued, more regular on his side. The tone of his messages became increasingly flirty. The ones she returned were newsy but emotionally deadpan. She gave nothing away, which was increasingly frustrating, as he was becoming more preoccupied with thoughts of her. He found himself waking up with Anita's face being the first image that popped into his bleary head. He suspected that while she was always his first thought, he was but an afterthought to her. She grew more attractive in his mind as the months passed, and then she had suddenly suggested that he visit Sweden, and not just for a weekend, a fortnight in the summer. That was back in February. He had booked his SAS flight from Newcastle to Copenhagen immediately, before she could change her mind. And then he had counted the weeks and days. His colleagues at the Cumbria Constabulary headquarters in Penrith were both intrigued and envious to hear of his trip. To the British, Sweden is a bit of an enigma, though they think they know it. With its dark nights, bouncy pop music, and fictional serial killers, it's not usually on their to-visit list. Most of his fellow police workers tended to fly south to Spain and Portugal for the sun. When you live in one of the rainier parts of Britain, heading north is considered rather strange. But then, they were never quite sure what to make of Detective Sergeant Kevin Ash. He wasn't local. Worse, he was a southerner from Essex. And he was far too chatty for a community that was friendly, but naturally reserved. Now that he was heading off to Scandinavia for a fortnight, the office would be a lot quieter. Anita had actually made the effort to clean her second-hand Peugeot before picking Kevin up. It still wasn't spotless, but it was passable. The greeting had been awkward. The half-embrace had turned into a formal handshake, but the smiles were genuine on both sides, and Anita found herself relaxing as they passed through the resplendent green countryside of a vibrant early June day. They had already dispensed with the details of Kevin's journey that day, which had involved both car and plane before coming to a juddering halt at Copenhagen's Kastrup airport. The train service that usually whipped freshly arrived passengers across the Øresund Bridge into Malmö was subject to an all-out strike. Such an action had surprised the Danes and Swedes as much as it had Kevin. Though striking was once a traditional British pastime, he had assumed that such a thing was beyond the efficient Scandinavians. As both employer and union seemed incapable of sitting down together, Kevin joked that the British could teach them a thing or two about the games that surround negotiations. It was the one thing that Britain still led the world in. As a result of the strike, He had to wait for a coach in the middle of what seemed like a rugby scrum.
You lot don't know how to queue either.
Until he and his fellow travellers were transported over the bridge by road. After the previous night's downpour, it was welcomingly hot. The sea shimmered on their right, and the trees and fields on their left were burgeoning with the verdure of the beginning of summer. As the spring had come unseasonably early this year, Anita explained that what they called the white period of hawthorn and apple blossom had already been and gone. When the conversation lulled, Gavin seemed quite content to drink in the sights of this new land. He hadn't been sure what to expect, but this beautiful, tranquil countryside was 1,000,000 miles away from the bleak landscapes of common British perception. The car manoeuvred off the main road and along a gravelled track. It curled round to the left, and Anita manoeuvred onto the grass next to a Fallon redwood cabin. There was a decked porch to the side, with outdoor furniture on it, which was invitingly bathed in sunlight. Gavin was childishly delighted that the house lived up to all his expectations of a typical Swedish dwelling. He noticed that there were 2 other houses along from Anita's rented home. The nearest was a solidly built, white-painted Dutch bungalow, with a tall, ugly stone chimney breast abutting the gable end. It had a grey tiled roof, in the centre of which, above the front door, was a wide dormer window. It had probably looked very smart when it was put up in the 1970s. Now it looked faded and tired. Beyond that was a stone cottage, the oldest building of the 3. As he got out of the car, he noticed that in the gaps between the surrounding trees, he could see the waters of the Baltic stretching away to the horizon.
"This is fantastic, Anita. Is there a beach near?"
"Just down there," she said, pointing to a path at the side of the house.
"Glad I brought my corsi."
"Pardon?"
"Swimming trunks."
"Well, why don't you go for a swim while I sort out the meal for tonight?" At that time in the afternoon, there were several people on the beach, which Gavin could see zigzagged its way along the coastline. Despite the heat, the water was cold, and it took him some minutes before he plunged fully in and headed out to sea. Anita had warned him not to go out too far, as there were strong currents. Once he got used to the temperature, he began to enjoy the freedom. He noticed that no one else was swimming. A few youngsters were playing at the water's edge, with a grandfather, ankle-deep, keeping an eye on them. As he paddled on the spot, he took in the view. He could see the 3 houses amongst the trees on the bluff above the beach. He had immediately taken to Anita's rented home. It was, he presumed, typically Scandinavian. Sparsely but tastefully furnished, no unwarranted fripperies. It was the casual, informal feel that was so different from anything he was used to in Britain. Anita had given him a brief tour. It had a functional but comfortable living room overlooking the sea, a neat kitchen diner, a bathroom and 2 bedrooms. Unsure where he was to be housed, he was about to put his luggage in the 2nd bedroom when Anita pointed to the room she obviously was using. "Aren't you going to stay in here?" she had said matter-of-factly. No messing around, no British-style prevarication. He hadn't needed a second invitation, and any embarrassment had been avoided. Now, as he headed back towards the beach, he couldn't remember when he had felt so happy. A quiet couple of weeks with a gorgeous woman like Anita would banish, albeit temporarily, the cheerless emptiness in his domestic life and the stresses and strains of a police career that was stagnating. Chapter 5. Chief Inspector Mowbray sat thoughtfully at the top of the table in the meeting room. Behind him was a blank whiteboard onto which photos of the victim would be attached, profiles of possible suspects would be added, and theories played out. He wondered if he should have had something to eat before the team meeting started. It had been a couple of hours since he'd demolished a burger brought in from McDonald's. He found it difficult to think on an empty stomach. And where was he going to dine tonight? His apartment wasn't an option. The 3rd, unlamented Fru Mowbray may have departed and taken her bile and ill will with her, but at least there had been someone at home waiting for him when he returned from work. They may not have spoken, or even slept in the same bed laterally, but, strangely, that was better than having nobody. After the initial month of euphoria following her walkout, when he'd felt free to come and go as he pleased, the answer...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?